Hi everyone, this is Sheila Shaffie and welcome back to another episode on ProcessArc's channel where we provide you with digestible business insights. Today we're going to continue our theme around business process performance. And this is important for us as owners of business units or executives or even process engineers, because when you can measure the performance of your business processes, you can uncover three things. We will be able to identify where we can effectively take excess operational cost out without negatively impacting client experience. We can uncover incremental revenue opportunities, and ultimately we'll get a better sense for how the processes under our purview impact the client experience overall. So today we're going to continue on with metric number 3. So far we've talked about percent rework, percent conversion, and today we're going to dive deeper into percent yield. So let's get started. Percent yield actually can go by different names as well. So let's talk about that before we jump right into an example on the mathematical calculation. So this may be the first time you actually have heard about the percent yield as it applies to process performance. But you may have heard of concepts like straight-through processing and frictionless processes. Those concepts fundamentally are tied with one another, because what percent yield is trying to figure out is what's the probability of getting work from the beginning to the end through a process without ever having to stop. So by definition, a straight-through process or a frictionless process is actually going after the same concept. Frictionless processes or straight-through processes are ones where you have the fastest version of a process. They are the most efficient and they have the highest level of customer experience. Think of a real life example. Let's think about taking a train from New York to Washington, and we have two options. And our objective is to get from New York to Washington the fastest possible way. And in between those two trains, you've got the local train that's going to make multiple stops, and you've got the express train. Guess what? We all want to be on that express train because it doesn't stop. That's a straight-through process. And that concept applies to any process that we have in a business. It doesn't matter if we're making faucets or a widget or onboarding a new customer for a life insurance company. The point is, every time a process stops to be validated, or additional information for it to be collected, for someone to review it, to sign off on it, means that it's no longer a straight-through process, that we have elongated the cycle time and potentially negatively impacted the client experience. So now let's jump right into the exact definition of percent yield. How do you mathematically calculate it? And how do you ultimately calculate the financial benefits, which identify opportunities for cost reduction, again, without impacting the client experience negatively. Now let's start reviewing the example. Here's the process map that we have been using so far in highlighting how to use different metrics. And again, this is a very high-level process map for onboarding a new customer. So before you can even think about or consider calculating a percent yield for your business processes, you need to have done two things. One, you had to have documented your process, as we've done here, and you have to have identified points in the process where inspection is taking place. So those are anything that looks like a diamond, where work is being stopped essentially to determine if it's in good order, that it has met all the requirements, that it can actually proceed. So looking at the first diamond, which is whether or not the client accepted the proposal, it looks like 65% of the time work is getting sent back, so it's getting reworked. But the yield, the positive yield out of this process is 35%, which means 35% of the time the client accepted the proposal and we can successfully, without doing any additional work, can proceed to the next phase in the process. And in this situation, 55% of the time, it looks like we can actually process the applications because we have absolutely everything we need to proceed. And then ultimately, the yield of the last inspection point is 90%. We need these three data points, the 35%, the 55%, and the 90% to calculate the total percent yield for this process. Let's keep going. Let's start with the textbook definition of percent yield, which is the probability of getting a single unit of work through the process without having to stop for one reason or another. Now, a unit of work could be anything. It could be a widget, it could be an application, it could be a sales order. It's just one thing that you have to process in order to get it to a completion state. So every time you stop the process for any reason, it could be validation, it could be approval, it could be for clarification, it could be that a piece of data was missing or a form was not submitted or a signature is missing. The root cause at this point in time is not important. What's important is that the process couldn't go from start to finish without stopping. And that is the way to calculate percent yield. Again, percent yield is looking at the chance, the probability of getting a single request from the beginning to the end of the process without having to rework it. Let me give you a mathematical example or a mathematical equation of what I'm talking about. So last week we talked about percent rework. Percent yield is the exact opposite of rework. So whatever you don't rework, whatever you don't stop the process to correct in some way or another is actually a yield to you. So think of a farm yield, right? What was the yield of that particular farm? How much work or how much goods did we get out of that farm or out of that process? I know we're not talking about corn or wheat or whatever, but I want you to conceptually connect these thoughts with one another. If you think about a business process, there are multiple points in that process where things may get held up. Every time that happens, there is a percent yield associated with that process step. So if you multiply the percent yield of every step that creates a stop or that things don't go through properly, if you multiply all those percent yields with one another, the cumulative effect gives you the total yield for that entire process from the beginning to the end. Now, this may be a bit confusing, but I'll show you in a process example how to calculate percent yield. As we saw in the process map example, there are 3 stages in the life cycle of that process where things will be inspected for accuracy, for completeness, and we may find issues with it, so rework is created. Again, anything that's not reworked becomes yield for that process step. So the 3% yields that were calculated were 35%, 55%, and 90%. If we multiply those 3% yields with one another, we get the total effect of all those failure points in the process. And the final number ends up being 17%. How do you interpret that number? It means that the probability of an application being able to go through proposal all the way to the customer receiving it and being satisfied with it is 17%. So 83% of the time, 83% of the applications stop for one reason or another. That's not good news for us. That means that we have a lot of work to do in identifying why things don't go through and what the ultimate financial ramifications are for the business. Now, I always go back to what you should be asking me or yourself is, okay, Sheila, who cares? Who cares if it's 17%? Who cares if it's 0%? Ultimately, we're doing all of these exercises around efficiency, metrics, creative problem solving to be able to figure out how to run the business more effectively and how to delight our customers. In the case of percent yield, every time you have low percent yield performance, it means that you are increasing your operational expenses, which is not a good thing. You are negatively impacting cycle time. You're actually elongating your cycle time, which is not a good thing. And that you're leaving money on the table, which is, again, not a great thing. And I'm sure we can logically work our way through this thing. Every time a process takes too long means I had to apply more labor, more cost, more human capital to it in order to get it done correctly, or even raw material. I built something incorrectly. Guess what? I got to have more raw material put into the machine for me to build something to specification. So it's going to increase my cost because I didn't do it right the first time. It's going to increase cycle time because instead of me being able to push that work through the process, now I have to stop that one piece that I can't process, wait for additional information, validation, correction, processing in order to get it right again, or to correct it before it can go through. So that unit of work, that application for that customer is being held up. That's not a good thing. And in terms of cash flow, conceptually, it's the same thing. The longer it takes us to process a request, the longer it takes us to get to the cash from the customer. So it's really important for us to compress the cycle time to squeeze as much yield as possible out of the process. I would make the argument that if your objective as an executive or a business unit manager is to take cost out of your business, in order to make the process speed up, in order for you to open up capacity so that you can do more work with the same number of people, percent yield is probably the most important metric that you can start measuring immediately. And you may have noticed that in order to do that, you have to do one thing first, which is to calculate percent rework. And to do that, you have to document your process and figure out where in the process failures are taking place, where in the process things are not going as expected, requirements are not being met, or additional work is being applied that's beyond the design intent of the process. So percent yield is really an amazing indicator of where excess cost is being applied and potentially where we are leaving the client with a less than desirable experience. I hope you enjoyed this week's video focused on how to improve operational efficiency and how to measure the performance of your business process using the metric percent yield. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave comments, questions, start using some of these tools and see how you end up. And if you get caught in something or something doesn't make sense in the presentation slides or your math doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. Leave a comment and we'll get back to you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.